welcome everyone. Our topic looking at the distinctions between conflict and family violence coercive control. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional owners and custodians of country and recognise their continued connection with the lands, water and culture, and pay my respects to elders past and present and any First Nations people that are watching this today. And I come to you from Gunai Kurnai country in Victoria. I'm Joanne Law, Director of Mediation Institute. What I've got for us today is to really look at conflict, coercive control, family violence and where the distinctions are, and they're not necessarily that distinct. And so it is a challenge for us working in this area. I have a little bit of a look at the escalation and some of the protections in place and some strategies for us. I thought a good place to start would be this conflict escalation model, where it goes from peace, where everyone's in harmony and getting along really well, all the way up to war, which in the context of dispute resolution, we're talking about situations where people commit atrocities, where they do things that really cause immense harm. So that's way outside the scope of our work, where there's legal interventions needed to stop, prevent or punish. But if we come back down to the other end, so what disturbs peace is the perception of difference and the inability or unwillingness to accept that difference. So to return to peace is understanding, acceptance and even valuing difference, but people can't value, at least accept. And I suppose, if we think about the context of society in many places, a lot of the problems really are coming from that inability or unwillingness to accept difference. So trying to force others to our own thinking. Beyond that, we get to disagreement, and what's needed is to discuss and negotiate a resolution for that disagreement. So it's usually going to be accept, alter or avoid. If it isn't resolved at that level, we've got a problem, and then problem solving strategies needs to come in place to try and understand the root causes of that disagreement that's creating a problem and resolve them. Often issues that come to us, they've been underground and not really spoken about very well before the problems escalate and become a dispute. And then dispute resolution strategies, trying to help people to move from positions, because they usually start saying, I want this or I want that, into interests, so why they want it, and trying to unpick that. Then if that doesn't get resolved, we're getting up into that conflict area where people start to use abusive language, yell and scream at each other, start to other each other. Really, it can become quite difficult for them to communicate in a respectful way. And so we're introducing strategies to try and support communication and then the dispute resolution and problem solving. Then if people resort to violence, we're starting to get up into that legal interventions to stop, prevent or punish. And then there might be behaviour change or other programs, restorative practices to try and re-engage. The complexity that we have as dispute resolution professionals is in that disputes, conflict, violence, because often they're mixed up and moving around in between each other. And it's not as clear cut as our little graph here. This is another model. That core of the conflict comes from a threat that people feel to their human dignity, their national pride, their physical safety, emotional needs, whatever aspect that they feel threatened, and then that leads to an emotional reaction and a personal response, and then you're getting the interpersonal response, but you've got your disagreement, becomes a problem that generally others start engaging with, and you're getting a community response, and then you're getting back out into bringing in independent people. Abusive control, where one person or a group denies the human rights and needs of another and instead uses whatever means necessary to maintain control over the other person's actions or behaviour. So you'll see, if you have a look at family violence, if we're looking in the family law context, the definition from the Family Law Act is very similar. So violence, threatening or other behaviour by a person that coerces or controls a member of that person's family or causes the family member to be fearful. And family violence is very much around that element of coercion or control, where one family member feels that they have the right to make the decisions unilaterally and they'll use whatever means. And there's a big list of examples provided in the Family Law Act, but they're not exclusive. So there's a whole lot of different ways that people may do that. And as technology is advancing, it's enabling, so stalking by using electronic means and all sorts of things like that are where conflict is, I suppose it could be defined as an active disagreement between people with opposing opinions, needs or priorities. How heated that conflict is, I suppose it will depend a little bit on the context. Conflict isn't necessarily about control, it's more around people competing to try and their solution or their options or their priorities met. Any thoughts? But anyway, that'll be what we're working with today. So the challenge is it's not that clean cut, because the behaviours that people use when they're in conflict or when they're attempting to use coercive control or family violence may be very similar. So we'll have a look at conflict styles again in a moment, just to refresh anyone who's not familiar with it. But things like positional hard bargaining, blaming and assumptions, all or nothing thinking, fixating on their own solution and discounting anyone else's ideas, being really angry, fearful, vengeful behaviour. All of those things are common in both abusive control, family violence and conflict. This is a model that I use a lot with clients, the concept of the Kilman conflict styles. People with high levels of assertiveness that use a competing style, that can often be perceived as being family violence because they are discounting other people's needs or interests. But if they aren't, they'll be able to shift. We'll be able to help them shift in the mediation process. The same thing, someone who's avoidant, that's often due to fear or other difficulties, but it can also be used strategically to prevent resolution and to misuse the dispute resolution process. Again, if it's just a conflict strategy, then we'll be able to get them to help to shift into engaging with the process. And then the third potentially problematic approach in the mediation context is accommodating. So where people will put their own needs aside for the point of the other person. So in this model, where it's not specifically talking about family violence or coercive control, that's seen as just being highly cooperative. And that can be the case, but in a family violence or situation where someone feels like their choices are limited, they will accommodate even at the expense of their own needs. So again, our role as dispute resolution professionals is to help people shift into a situation where they can reach a resolution that's going to be acceptable or appropriate for all parties involved, with either a compromise or a collaboration looking for a way to get a win. So for me, I find this a really powerful model in the work that we're doing to try and help clients to see whether they are able to shift. I'll often talk about it with clients when it's through really strongly that they do have one of these conflict styles that aren't really that helpful in mediation, and help give us more indication about whether they are going to be able to shift their approach. Any thoughts or comments? Does anyone else use this style with clients, or this kind of model with clients? Okay, so I've got a little bit of a table here just to help look at those nuanced differences between people that are in disputes and conflict and where we've got abusive control or family violence that's current and ongoing. So disputes and conflict, they result from differences in views and needs. Often people are going to need a third party to resolve the conflict and avoid it escalating further. But the fact that someone has a different need or doesn't agree, that isn't family violence in and of itself. But where you've got a power imbalance, where one person is imposing their views or needs on the other and the other really doesn't have an option, that's where we're starting to get into that abusive control situation. Disputes and conflict, they can be resolved by negotiation and agreement, but working with them, we can help people to consider the other point of view or the other person's side of things. Whereas abusive control, family violence, it tends to be one-sided. And the goal is not the issues so much as controlling the other person. It's a little bit when you're working in that situation where you have started a mediation, you're not really aware that's the dynamic. It's like every time something looks like it's going to be resolved, something else will pop up. It's not really the issues, that they're just symptoms of this strategy to control the other person. Conflict's inevitable. Nothing is constant forever in equilibrium. Things crop up. It's not that conflict is bad or wrong in and of itself. Whereas abusive control, again, it's very prevalent, but I think it's not inevitable. And we're seeing more and more in countries like Australia, where abusive and controlling behaviours are being criminalised and recognised that they're not acceptable in a just society. It's seen as family violence, or it's seen as unacceptable behaviour in the workplace and other contexts. With disputes and conflict, there's the option where people are willing to experiment and grow. So even where they're fairly entrenched in the conflict, they may be willing to try something for a period of time or agree to a step process. Where in abusive control, they're really very resistant to change. The person who's controlling doesn't necessarily see a problem with their behaviour. In conflict, we test boundaries, and sometimes the result of conflict can be growth and innovation, because they're agreed or unwritten rules or restrictions that people are maintaining with, and the conflict provides the opportunity to explore new opportunities. Where with abusive control, we're really one person is establishing and maintaining really rigid boundaries. So any infringement in their mind deserves punishment. If people will engage with conflict, it's a way of testing values and beliefs, and often outdated beliefs can be updated. Whereas, again, with that abusive control, they're extremely resistant. They just beliefs are treated as if they're true, and whatever they value is treated as what's important, and anyone else's values are discarded or discounted. Conflict exposes and questions power differences. So privilege or can be seen as a problem and can be discussed, where in abusive control, the power difference is treated as the way it should be. Now, a really classic one here is where we're talking about gendered violence, where a male believes that it's his right or role to control his partner and children. And in those situations where those beliefs are really entrenched, any efforts to change that are seen as unwanted interference and not valid. Whereas someone who may hold these beliefs but are more flexible may be willing to explore the benefits of a more equal relationship. Both can be quite contradictory, but conflict is seen as a lack of balance, distress, but it can also be empowering, questioning, learning a relationship, whether it's a co-parenting relationship or rather after moving through conflict can become stronger. Whereas abusive control, it can look like intimate terrorism, but it can also look like nurturing, passionate intimacy, caring, benevolence. I'm thinking in particular of abusive control where the partner is disabled or has some issue where the abusive partner is able to appear on the outside as being, oh, you're a saint for all you do, but they're actually being abusive behind closed doors. and they really don't want their power relationship to change. So a lot of information there. What do people think? Is that valid? Does any of that resonate? I won't go right through this because it goes through similar concepts, and if you're watching this on a recording, you can always stop and read through it. But I suppose the key thing with coercive control and people that are using family violence in that way of maintaining power over, it tends to be very static. There's no responsibility for their own actions, or their actions are seen as being justified. And whenever we start talking about that, they'll minimise or blame the other person for their behaviour. So a couple of the models that can help us to think through this is there's the visible, the behaviour, what they say and do. If we're doing a pre-mediation, this might be the statements, the actions. Are they doing insults? Are they attacking? And then there's the invisible stuff. So what's the context that they're in? Cultural, social, political, economical, historical. So what are the dynamics that may be relevant? And then attitudes. People tell us what their attitude is. We can hear those things in what they choose to say. So we're assessing the prejudices, the beliefs, the perceptions, those sorts of things, and also needing to be careful about those in ourselves because they will also filter how we perceive and hear what's being said to us. This model, a conflict resolution triangle, looks at, we've got three sides, the people supporting the people, the process. So it's very important for us to control the process when we're working with people that are in conflict or potentially who are abusively controlling others. And then, if possible, to resolve the issues, we're going to need to move the conversation, the understanding from assumptions to facts. So finding out what's the reality of the situation, from positions to needs and interests. So from this is what I want to why is that important? What will that give you? How will that affect the situation? What do you think it'll be like? And because if we're looking at the context of family dispute resolution, how's that going to impact the children? How's that go with their best interests? Shifting people from arguing their positions to considering options. So brainstorming, looking at all the different ways that things can be resolved. So if you've got someone who really is just not engaging at all in option generation, that can be a bit of an indicator that they don't want things to change. They don't want things to get better. This is what they want. And again, moving from focusing on issues to exploring solutions. So we've all had clients that have got a huge list of issues and things that have gone wrong that the other person's done, but they're not willing to look at solutions. How could it work? What would make things better? What is a way to maintain that relationship without the risk? And then moving from consequences of the past events to reality testing proposals for resolution. So that's, again, thinking about our process where we're wanting to get a movement from higher up in that conflict style list down to agreed solutions that will provide acceptance. One of the really long-term tools that's been available is the Duluth model, which is in a particular context. Sometimes people criticise because they say, oh, it's gendered, and it is, because that's what it's about. It's a model that's looking at gendered violence. So some of these things you would be able to flip into other types of relationships, but they've also got tools and resources for other relationships, so same-sex, female violence against men. So if you haven't had a look at the full range, there's a number of, and it's not just necessarily family context, but this one quite helpful because this is the context that we as mediators are working with people. Generally, we're looking at that power and control. There's been prior physical, potentially sexual, coercive controlling behaviour against, in this case, the mother and children as a kind of outer ring. There's an unrelenting focus. So that's a really big red flag. If they're really caught up in their whole life is consumed in this person who doesn't want to be their partner anymore. And underlying it is the use of systems and institutions to perpetuate that connection and abuse, using harassment and intimidation, undermining parental ability, and unwilling to work with the partner to co-parent or even provide some stability for the children, discrediting them as a parent or as a person, withholding financial support. So there's some further strengthening of the Family Law Act around that in terms of property settlements. That continues to be an issue. Endangering children, so neglect, putting them in inappropriate situations, using violence, disregarding the children, again, disrupting the relationship with the children, that deliberate alienation, and using physical or sexual violence against them. I do think it's useful to remind us, and also this model of the family violence escalation. It's a similar, I suppose this is the interface where we go from conflict. So normal conflicts arise within the relationship. If it remains unresolved, it can build over time. If one person or one parent gains control, then that creates a power imbalance. And then this becomes a repeated cycle that may also incorporate manipulation and harm. So intentional harm is created, whether that's to each other, to the relationship with their children, and so on.
Joanne,
Yep.
may I ask, at what point would you stop the mediation and go and get some advice from a supervisor if you didn't feel comfortable? But if you could see these things happening, at what point would you stop it?
Look, as I guess it depends where. So sometimes it may be when you're still doing your intakes and you realise that, yeah, the dynamic here is really, really skewed. But yeah, if you're in a mediation, you're probably going to go to private sessions and check in and see what's going on. But yeah, as soon as you're feeling like, oh, I don't think this is just conflict. I think that there's something more going on here. I don't know. I don't know if that's helpful. I
Yeah,
think,
no, it is. It is. I just wanted to say, yeah, if we're talking about if we're in the mediation or is this like at the assessment, but I do understand what you're saying. So
yeah, like it's all the way through. And sometimes, particularly with that systems abuse, people can use mediation to prevent going into other systems where they might lose control. and
yeah.
and we may have multiple mediators. They want to have multiple mediations. You're fabulous. You're the best mediator, but they're not making any progress at all. And we got to start thinking, am I being used here? Yeah. So I guess
Yeah.
on it's an ongoing process for us to try and look at what this dynamic is. And
Mm.
look, here's a couple of our strategies as well. Really active listening. So we're listening for those beliefs and values as well as the words. And we're looking at the body language, we're looking at the behavior that's going on to try and get a better feel for what's really happening. Wanting to use our communication styles and approaches to try and promote empathy. People that are coercive controllers, family violence, there's generally not a lot of empathy for the other party. And that's going to help us to see what's going on as well. I'm a strong advocate for setting behaviour ground rules at pre-mediation, letting people know my approach is we'll just use first names or names if you're in a cultural situation where first names isn't appropriate, and not use other terms, because people, whether they're angry or whether they're trying to align you, they'll often use very inflammatory and negative terms to describe the other person. And that's a little bit around clarifying and setting behaviour limits and boundaries as well. People who feel justified in their behaviour are probably going to continually be testing your boundaries. So again, that's another thing that's letting you know, okay, maybe this isn't the right process for this family. But are there ways that we can modify the process enough to balance those power dynamics, whether that's lawyer inclusive, shuttle, time shifting, all sorts of options? And I'll talk about it in a moment, but almost always if people have been in this dynamic, there's going to be complexity and additional vulnerabilities, most likely for the person that's been subject to this abuse. And we need to think, is another process available or better? Anyone that's a mediator is a strong advocate for our process. We believe in it. However, if people are up in that upper extreme, it's not going to be as protective potentially as a different process. So we need to bear that in mind. And this comes to our responsibilities and also our referral processes. With the legal protections, there's family violence restraining orders, so they may be in place and it allows mediation to try and negotiate an agreement, but that does need to be appropriate within the context of the family violence that we've had reported to us. There may be criminal charges, and sometimes we're asked to mediate where someone's in jail or they're being released from jail and they're wanting to now have contact with their children. So there's a whole lot of complexity around that. We are mandatory reporters, and that goes into the child protection systems. And I don't know if everyone here has done a mandatory report, but it's you can ring the appropriate agency and talk to them. This is my situation. This is the gut feeling I've got. This is what's been said, and then they'll be able to make an evaluation as well of how they're going to treat it. So sometimes people agonize too much about whether or not they need to make a mandatory report. If by all means, if you've got a supervisor or a supervision group, take it to them first. But ultimately, the child protection, the person on the other end of the phone in the child protection agency has got their specialist training and experience as well. And then, of course, the family law system. And the challenges there is, particularly if there's been financial abuse, often the person who's abused doesn't have resources. And so trying to use mediation in a way that accentuates their vulnerabilities and doesn't necessarily protect them. We need to make sure that we're doing a really good intake and we're looking at not just what the other issues might be, is how can we help people to connect with resources that might support them. So housing is a major one. So you've got people that are staying in abusive situations separately under the one roof after they separate because they just can't find anywhere to live. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be connecting them into the system. It may not be working perfectly, but at least if they know it's available, because they may have been told for years that there's no other options, there's nothing you can do, and they could be less resourceful than they might otherwise be. So making sure that you know what's available, shelters and crisis support, family violence hotlines or support services, legal aid, advocacy, so knowing where people can get legal advice at various financial levels and support. Often with family violence, there may be businesses and other things that one person's created that makes the whole accessing centre care and various support more complicated because they can't provide clear information, but there are some organisations that might be able to help them to work through that. Mental health support services. Being exposed to abuse and family violence for a long time, or even extreme, it's not good for our mental health. So people are probably struggling with anxiety, depression, they may have other underlying mental health issues. So how can they get access to support? Remember, as family dispute resolution practitioners, if we refer people to others than they have, there's inadmissibility protections there built into the Family Law Act. So making use of that, because often people are frightened that if they work with a psychologist, then their information will be subpoenaed. There have been improvements on that in the Family Law Act for directly as well, but it's still a good idea to make it nice and clear by using that, making sure that you do those warm referrals if necessary, if that's a concern. Support groups can be really helpful as well. And substance abuse, again, that's a really common tactic that coercive controllers use. They use substances to make their victim dependent on them. They might be the supplier, or it could be that they've turned to substances to be able to cope with their living situation. So that's creating another layer of vulnerability. And financial counselling and support services, debt and issues around that tend to be a really common problem that we see for people in these sort of situations. Not a pretty picture. We hope that we can try and help people prevent getting into this much of a complexity. We know that children exposed to family violence are more likely to be users and perpetrators of family violence. So if we can help to limit or reduce the exposure that children have to this, there's more chance that they will develop healthier relationship strategies. So I guess the key takeaways that I was hoping that you might get from this is that conflict can be managed, but family violence generally requires intervention. It's generally a pattern of behaviour that's around controlling those family members by the other person. Recognising early warning signs can try and help prevent escalation and greater harm. If we can intervene earlier rather than later, that's good. Connecting people to resources and support networks is really essential for those subject to family violence. I can't think off the top of my head, the data people leave of times before they finally end a relationship. Often that's not because they want to go back, it's because they don't have the resources to survive or feel that they can adequately care for their children outside of that. So they get,
It's about 7 times, Joanne.
Thank you. Thank you. I was thinking 7 and then I was thinking, no, I'm not going to say something that I just feel like I'm making up. So think, yeah. And, it's accepted as, oh, yeah, that's what it is. But it's often because they just don't have the resources to make it, or they feel like they. And in FDR and in mediation, we can be helpful in resolving disputes and conflict. Sometimes we can even be a starting point for people turning away from coercive control, but safety always comes first. So we can't get too in love with our process and persevere where it may not be appropriate. And that is a clear obligation that we have as FDRPs not to proceed. We must not proceed if people aren't in a position to be able to negotiate freely. Questions and comments? I hope you found some of these models, distinctions and tips helpful in your work with conflict and family violence. It's tempting to name anything where there is heightened tensions as family violence, but the real key distinction is around whether or not people are able to self-determine whether their choices are limited by the family member. It's a very important distinction for us, particularly family dispute resolution practitioners, where we need to determine whether people are able to participate in FDR. It's not whether or not there has been family violence or violence, it's whether or not people are going to be free to negotiate, whether participating is going to increase risk for children, and so on.